Hi, welcome to this presentation on garbage in, garbage out, or making data work for you. I'm Nigel Davies. I'm director with Evolve Consultancy, a BIM and information management consultancy based in the UK. Myself, I have 20 plus years, a bit more now, in engineering and architecture. I've been part of the PAS 1192 Part 2 steering committee. I'm still part of the UK BIM Alliance, NEMA as it is now, the Guidance Focus Group, and Building Smart UKI Implementation Group. When we look at the way the construction industry has changed over the last 5-10 years, what we can say is that the 1192 suite of documents and now ISO 19650 have had a big impact on how we deliver the projects. I think one of the things you can look at when you're talking about this is if you ask each person on a project team what's the most important part of a building, each one will give you a different answer. Is it the context? Is it the aesthetics, the form, the function? Is it the cost? Is it the value to the community? Is it the carbon footprint? Whoever you ask, you are going to get a different answer. And if you bring into that equation the different types of buildings that you might be working on, does that change? Especially when you nowadays get into residential, especially high-rise. Does health and safety become a major issue? Yes. Is it about operations and maintenance? You ask a different person, you'll get a different answer. But what is important here, that apart from a couple which are subjective, to be able to analyze any of those figures, you need data. You need data to be able to understand exactly what's going on and how well it is performing against your expectations. That's not just across the final handover and into operations of a building. It's also during all stages of the project. Through design, through construction, and through maintenance, what kind of data you're working with and the importance of it is paramount to being able to get the most out of those stages. It is important to realize that data is not just for handover. Data is important at all stages. So here's a diagram here, just a little circle based on the RIBA stages of work, and data can be used at any point in this. At pre-design, at conceptual stages, when you're looking at the function of the building, how much it's going to cost, the environmental information, the intended performance of the building. And as you take that through the early design stages, when you've got an outline solution at stage 3, can this information be used effectively for tendering or for identifying the functionality or the contents of the room? There's an example I love to use at this stage where we were working with a university, local university, and to them, the data sheets at room 3 were critical for delivery to make sure that there's no heating and water storage in the same room. Otherwise, you've got a volatile combination that could lead on to problems with Legionella and those kind of things. And to them, understanding how their design was laid out, even without detailed drawings or models at this stage, just from those kind of spreadsheets, they could analyze the data and understand whether there were risks involved in the design going forward. As you go then through later design stages, of course, you're heading towards construction stages and you need to agree costs. Yes, can you use the data for construction? Is there enough in there to produce schedules, those kind of things? And of course, yes, at handover and operations, you need to understand what has actually been delivered, the actual products used as opposed to the design products used, whether there are warranties, whether the performance data is being monitored, whether you have the right documentation in a residential building for washing machines and the cookers, whether they have been delivered or whether the data is available online. All of these kind of things can be delivered, and encompassing all of that, even more important now as of yesterday with the Grenfell report being delivered, health and safety. Throughout of this, how are you managing that? Do you have the data to be able to manage this effectively? Well, when we talk to FM specialists about what they actually need, or we talk to client bodies, quite a lot of data that's asked for on projects actually isn't really required. What we find coming out of these investigations is that there are pretty much 4 things that you need to specify and understand about anything. You can break it down to these 4 simple categories. The first being, what is it? Now, of course, that's going to vary what you mean by what is it at different stages of the project. Is this a residential building? Is the wall concrete? Is the wall brick? When you start getting down into product specification, then what type of doors are you talking about? Who's the manufacturer of the PA system you've got in your building? And that's the first problem that a lot of people face when specifying data and actually delivering data in simple terms. Here's 3 examples from building services. If you're a building services engineer and you understand what they are, great. What are they? You can point to those and go, okay, that's an air handling unit, that's a damper. But the problem comes when these things are being modeled, design stages, particularly early design stages, they're all being modeled as this. Yes, if you understand what you're looking at, you can look in context and realize, yes, there's ducts into it. Yes, there's a fan core unit, who knows, whatever. But that's not optimizing the use of data. To be able to specify what this is, you need to understand how it's going to be delivered, how it's going to be visualized. How do you identify that? Well, of course, the first thing you can say there is, well, it will have an object type on it. Whoever would have built this would say, yes, it's that. Great. Is that in the same location for everybody working on the project? If they're all providing information, can you go to a single property and identify what it is? No. In which case you need to be specifying where that data needs to be delivered. And there are standards for this, of course. You have the IFC schema, which will tell you where things should go. But one of the simplest ways of identifying something, even using terminology, your category terminology or your manufacturer's terminology can be ambiguous. If you use a classification system to identify an object, that starts to become clear what it is. But of course, that also means you need to specify what classification system you use and which table from that classification system you should be specifying. That may change at different stages, but at least you're starting to get into understanding a consistent definition of what needs to be delivered. The next thing is, where is it? Here's an example from a project we've recently worked on where you're looking here at just the air conditioning and building services design. Even if you have an air handling unit, where does it exist in the building? Now that's pretty simple to accomplish. Spaces, rooms, they are there for a purpose. And when you start to look at deliverable mechanisms like COBie, yes, you have items that sit, or instances, components that sit inside of spaces, rooms. You can identify where it is. But think about this. That's 2 of the basic things that people need to repair or replace a piece of equipment. What is it? Well, okay, I don't need to know all the ins and outs about it. I don't need to know at this point whether it's got a smooth white finish or whether it, even perhaps what the cost is at this point. First of all, I need to identify what it is and where it is. After that, I can start to think about what else do I need to know to be able to either repair, maintain, or replace that product. And that brings you to the third thing, which is what data is needed. This is a harder one to answer, but and of course it's going to be stage based. But the thing here to remember is what data is needed. You don't have to look like this example here in front gives at COBie and look at all the fields and go, yes, 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 yes. They're all required. Obviously they're required for a reason because COBie is specifying it. Let's make sure they're all in there. No, what you really need to appreciate at each stage of the project is what data is actually needed. What does somebody need to be able to do their job? What data does somebody need to be able to provide the information for somebody else to do their job? And so that's the fourth item, when. When is this data needed? A lot of people would have you believe that the data isn't needed until the very end of the project. Well, of course, that's not true. We've seen an example earlier where certain data is needed at stage 3. And of course, depending on what project it is you're working on, even if it's not a building project, if it's infrastructure, when you need the data is going to vary. But again, the thing to look at here when you're specifying it is need. What is needed at each of these stages to be able to deliver the job effectively? And this is where we run into our first practical implementation problem. People don't pay any attention to when data is needed if it doesn't fit their own worldview. Here's a quick diagram. This diagram shows the theory of when data should be produced. You would hope that by the time you get to stages 6 and 7 that you have got all the information you need. This line actually isn't a mistake. You aren't seeing this actually dropping. It is actually dropping off after the end of stage 5 a little bit to stage 6 and 7, because a lot of the data needed in construction isn't necessarily relevant to stage 6 and 7. Again, talking to FM specialists, they don't need a complete accurate model of each product in the building. We actually worked with one team that said, we don't care what it looks like. It could be a cylinder or a cube for all we care, so long as we know, can we get to it? When do we need to repair it? When do we need to maintain it? So, I haven't been silly enough to drop this line all the way down, but principle is there. You will produce a lot of data for stage 5 that isn't necessarily needed once it's been handed over. Additionally, there will be other information that you need for maintenance and operations, which you wouldn't have before then. But here's the principle. That is the theory of how data should be produced, increasing particularly through stage 3 and into stage 4, where you are doing spatial coordination, schematic design through into detailed design. And then, of course, the more you know about the job as it's being built, there will be more data added in. But what tends to happen is people ignore data requirements. You've got drawings to do, you've got specifications to produce, you've got calculations to submit. So what you tend to find happen is this. Yes, at the start of the project, there will be, particularly let's say you start modeling around the start of stage 3. Yes, there'll be schematic drawings before that, but you start modeling at stage 3. There will be a big push. There will be an increase in the data available simply by adding elements into your models. That will continue mostly through stage 3. It'll taper off a little bit, no doubt. And of course, a lot of this is going to depend on how much data you already have in your components when you place them in your model. It's nice to see that a lot of building services company in particular we work with now, and structural engineers actually, you get their models, they've got a lot of this identification data in there from the start. It's part of their standard library of components. What we don't like to see is the instances where architects are dropped, sorry to knock the architects here, but when they're dropped into a project and they're being, you have to deliver COBE, you have to deliver this Department for Education, those projects now, there's a lot of demands on the data that's being issued, and the fees suddenly go up. And what you see the architects doing is trying to compensate for not having this data available in their own libraries and expecting to be able to cover those fees, those costs, by pushing it all back to the client and saying, if you want this data, you're going to have to pay us to put it into your models. Well, one of the clients we work with actually said, we're not paying for you to add that data into your models for every other client you ever work with. We expect that data to be part of your models now. It's an interesting perspective, and it's the way the industry is actually changing. But back to point. Here, what you're seeing is once you get to stage 4, the focus is different. The focus is now on information production with a small I. Data doesn't get that kind of look in that it did have as the models were produced. And what tends to happen is, even if you're monitoring and recording this, there's a big push at the end of stage, just when you don't want it to happen, because you have to concentrate on other things. But at the end of stage, you realize that you've not got enough data in there to get it through the QA requirements of your client at the end of stage. It's not uncommon now to be working on large frameworks or larger projects where the client will reject the deliverables because it doesn't have the data in it. And the same then happens through stage 5. of course, you're concentrating then on can the information actually be built? Is the project going together well? Have you got the information delivered just in time to be able to get it constructed? And again, what you find is you get to the end of stage 5 and there's another big push before the handover and acceptance of the final deliverables to get all the data that's needed in there. That may then happen, particularly if you're doing soft landings or you've got some kind of handover period and monitoring period. There may come a point where you realize you don't have all the information you need. That's got to be found. And then finally, you can get to sign off and acceptance of the final deliverables. But this shouldn't happen. But it happens for lots of reasons. Yes, I've already spoken about the pressures on people to get other things delivered. And with timeframes compressing and fees compressing, what do we expect? This is going to happen. But good specification of data can help overcome that. What you don't want to see is this kind of thing happening. This is an agenda. And if you look for where the information is actually dealt with, it's always at the end. How many of you have sat in on project meetings and you've been twiddling your thumbs for an hour, 2 hours waiting? Okay, now we're talking about the information management. You go through the design stuff. It's a secondary thought. It's not really part of the integrated design of projects at this point in time. What we should see here is under the architectural section, under the structures and civils, under the MEP, there should be design progress and deliverables progress, which includes this information. This is all information and it's all integrated together. But what's worse, or one of the things that really affects me, is when you're talking to people about this, they go, yes, I'll send the BIM guy to the meeting, don't worry about that. Well, they're not the person I want to be speaking to. I want to be speaking to the architects, to the engineers, so that they understand that this affects all of them, not just the guy who's going to be inputting data into the Revit model. That's not enough. On all of our projects, we check all of this information as we're going through regularly. It's common for us, particularly through stages 3 and 4, to do at least monthly, if not fortnightly checks of the information. And here I'm not just talking about, is there a classification code on the object? Is there this? We are checking the designs as well to make sure that there are the right number of doors, there are the right number of windows, the windows are the right type, there's egress routes. Whatever the client expects, we can build it in. We use a piece of software called Celebri because it's got a very good logical rules engine. But once this is set up, we can actually set these checks going and review the models to understand what is going according to plan and what isn't. That then, of course, gets fed back in through coordination meetings to the teams to tell them exactly what's going on. And to give them actions, not just on the design, the coordination side of things, but also on the data side, so that we don't end up with this situation at the end of stage where everybody is panicking to try and get the data into their models. A really simple way of presenting that back to the team are really simple charts. This is an example from Excel. We've got Power BI. We're working on some other things in the background where people will be able to log in and see their dashboards online. But this is actually the simplest way of doing it. You don't need too much technology for this. For each of those models that we're looking at there, we take key performance indicators and we measure those in the model. So it might be, to start off with, because all of these things are percentages, how many elements are there in the model? As the elements increase, the percentages may drop a little bit, but you're keeping an eye on things as they go through. How many, for example, elements in there have a type? So you can actually identify what it is. How many of them have a classification code so they can identify what they are? Put those into a simple table, and then most importantly, this is done on a week-by-week, month-by-month basis that shows how the job is progressing through the stages. Here you can see a really good example of where we reached the end of stage and that data had to be input before it could be accepted. The drop afterwards is for the next stage when more elements were added to the model. But you'll see that's a really good visual of what actually happens on projects. And then, of course, the other thing that happens as you get towards the end, time is ticking, we're getting near to delivery. Commercial pressures hit in and you get the commercial managers going, forget about that nonsense. We got to get this drawing out the door. We got to get the piles in the ground. It's easy to forget the data. It's easy just to think that's not important, get it delivered. but at what cost? If you look at the ratio of design to construction to operations, you'll realize these commercial pressures are very self-centered and they are naive in terms of where the biggest cost is on the project. The biggest cost is the years the building is in operation. And so all of this comes back to specifying data. How do you make it easy for you? Data is just 3D design, stealing this from somebody, but 3Ds. You need to define clearly what data is required and when. Consider, if you can, possible scenarios for the data during the operation of the project and what people will actually need at the end of its life, and also during the other stages of the project. At very minimum, ensure you can identify what it is and where it is. You need to then develop the design and the data throughout the project. Make sure that it's a consistent and continually review the accuracy and completeness and correctness of that data. Finally, deliver. Avoid getting everything together at the point of delivery. Make sure that you have looked forward and looked at risks to delivery, and you've identified any challenges for getting that information complete and delivered before you get to that point. You can never underestimate planning. Provided you've got a good definition and you're developing the data throughout the project, you will be able to deliver much more effectively. Thank you. Short whistle-stop tour there. Raised a lot of questions, I'm sure. If you need to get hold of us and talk about any of these things, hopefully we'll see you in person at the BIM Coordinator Summit. But if not, there's our contact details. Evolve at info-consultancy.com. Telephone number there for our London office. Thank you very much indeed, and hope to see you soon.